Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Great to see you, Jason.
So, Chuck, you were a squadron leader in the Navy SEALs and you're in SEAL Team 6. But right now, there is a lot going on, and you've been following the war in Ukraine day by day since even before it began. But what is happening now? What are we seeing in Europe? What are we seeing the Russians do? And what's happening in Ukraine? What should we make of all these different puzzle pieces if we want to put them together?
Let's start in Ukraine, and of course, the center of gravity of the Russian effort there is a little town called Pokrovsk, which the Russians announced their summer offensive, which began in March. Luckily for them, their fiscal year losses look better that way. But the Russians put 110,000 soldiers into the Pokrovsk area of operations. Almost every one of them are now casualties. There was a Russian breakthrough, much lauded by the tankies of the world. It was in the wrong direction. It broke through to the north of the city, just west of Novoshakhova. By the way, now that salient is broken into pieces with one of section cut off, and the Russians are not looking too good in Pokrovsk. And that will bring us eventually, you and I are going to talk about what's going on in Europe. And I think it's a direct result of Russian failures on the battlefield. They're literally spreading out the zone of conflict.
So, what does that mean in real terms? Why is it being spread out, and what effect will that have on this war?
Well, it's a bit classic Soviet sort of a technique, disperse the chaos. And one of the most chaotic events of last week, all of the airports in Denmark were closed due to drone intrusions over the runways. Now, that, of course, meant air traffic control could notice these drones, perhaps radar picked it up, but it amounted to every airport in the country being shut down. That is a major factor. Copenhagen, as we both know, major airport, major connecting location through Europe. Interestingly enough, there was a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker in the vicinity of Denmark during these airspace intrusions. It was called the Pushpa. That is a classic ghost fleet tanker carrying 115,000 tons of oil. It sailed away from Denmark, but very interestingly, Jason, this afternoon it was seized by French authorities off the coast of France. And as we are making this, there are French, I presume, special operations forces. They're on board the tanker and they have taken it into custody related to the Danish airspace.
But so far, we've seen that Russia routinely is flying drones over European airspace. Why are they doing that, and why are they not being shut down? What does it indicate? What is the problem here?
Well, of course, it is Russia conducting these gray zone operations, right? The Russians, of course, denied they had anything to do with the Danish intrusions, even though there was a Russian warship, a Rapushka class LST, which was also lingering near Danish territorial waters during these drone intrusions. It is a great question to ask, why isn't Europe doing anything about it? I'm afraid the answer is very sobering. A country like Denmark, and in fact, most other European countries, they can't do anything about it. All they can do is see these drones. They lack the electronic warfare capability. Sometimes they lack the ability to even detect these in fact, the thing that the Danes discovered about their airfield intrusions were because the drones had turned their lights on. So you could see this was a deliberate disruption. If you didn't notice me, I'm turned my lights on now, so you will do something about it. But the really sobering thing is they couldn't do anything about it. They had to close the airports and wait literally until the bad guys left. We're going to see more of these attacks, I think, not less.
So that brings us to another point. We perhaps did not see the drones, but we do see the oil tankers, the Shadow Fleet, going around the world, and the West is not interdicting it. Why is that? What's going on? Is it possible, or is it perhaps outside of our physical capacity to stop these Russian tankers that are under sanction and continuing to operate?
Well, it absolutely could. It's refreshing to see that the French did something about Pushpa. And again, she is right now, as you and I report, she is under the control of the French authorities. Look, it'll come out that they have the goods on this ship. Like this ship is 800 or 900 feet long. It's a very large crude carrier. Look, this means there were FSB people aboard with the drones controlling them from this ship. Again, a classic gray zone operation. This ship is not flagged in Russia. It's flagged as a flag of convenience. It is part of the shadow fleet. But the French wouldn't have come aboard unless they had in the Navy what we call the dope, right? They can prove by radar that these drones were launched from and returned to this ship. I'm very glad to see this because it's something that could be done around the world because every one of these shadow fleet tankers, look, they're sailing with unqualified crews. They don't have safety and life at sea gear. They don't have adequate environmental protections. They don't have insurance. Their flags of convenience aren't in order. So every one of these tankers, 600 of them, could be interdicted around the world. And Russia doesn't have a navy that could stop it, right? And I think it's also interesting. The French decided to seize this tanker, but they didn't do it in the Baltic because there are Russians in the Baltic, but there aren't any Russians in the North Atlantic. So hopefully this will be the first of more to come.
So, by international law, that's all that's necessary, these sorts of violations, and any country can stop these ships? Or how does that work? They have to be in the territorial waters of those countries, or what's the rule?
Well, in terms of the Pushpa, it appears that it was in French territorial waters. However, you know, Russian tankers economically, they have to work out of the Baltic. Russia doesn't have any warm water ports. Their choices are Murmansk in the Arctic or Vladivostok way over in the Pacific. So Russia needs Baltic traffic to carry out these shadow fleet operations. Their big liability is, look, again, they're not sailing with qualified crews. They are not compliant with the ecological precautions they have to take for these ships. They're not insured. Their papers are not in order. And any nation, and especially Denmark, has the right to check these ships as they make their transits, especially because the risk of an environmental disaster in one of these ships, frankly, I'm amazed it hasn't happened yet, especially because many of them transship their oil, literally putting a pipe from one ship to the other. And they do this in the Mediterranean off the coast of Greece, which is a NATO member. You might ask yourself, what's the deal? However, I really think that as Russia, they've jumped the shark. They use this shadow fleet tanker to launch airspace penetrations, and now they're going to pay for it. We've seen that NATO countries will seize these tankers. The Eagle S, which damaged cables in the Baltics, they were surprised one night when Finnish naval commandos fast roped aboard, and that ship is still anchored off Helsinki, where it's likely to be sold because it's been seized.
So Russia as a whole is having a lot of problems, and it needs this fleet quite obviously because it needs the money. Russia is very dependent on oil and gas. In fact, about 45% of the national budget of Russia comes from oil and gas. But if this Black Sea fleet were to be limited, it were to be routinely having problems with foreign navies coming aboard and seizing them, that would destroy the Russian economy. Which raises yet another question. If we know that, and we know they're violating the law, and they're being used not only to circumvent sanctions, but in fact to attack NATO states, what's the holdup? Why are we not going after these ships?
Well, I used to be an operator, not a policymaker. There's a question of political will. I think this time with Pushpa, they had her dead to rights, right? So they've got the receipts. As this drone incursion happened, once it happened, they were able to turn all their sensors on and see. But you talk about an egregious violation, right? You're using a ship, you're conducting airspace violations. I mean, this is clearly a criminal act. I think this is going to blow back on Russia because this is something they've gotten away with and they've pushed the envelope as they often do. For example, the airspace violations in Estonia. Of all the Baltic nations and of all the NATO countries, the one country you can pick on is Estonia because they have minimal air defenses. But again, they've raised the temperature, and I think we are going to see the political will, hopefully, going forward, that some of the guilty are going to get punished.
So if they get punished, what should we expect? What do we see going on right now, perhaps on the battlefield, that is evidence of the fact that Russia is not doing well, and it's related to the fact that its economy is doing worse. We know the Russian economy is doing worse and worse. We know, in fact, they're getting less money from the oil revenue. They're having more and more economic problems. At the same time, Ukraine is striking things such as the supply lines going to Russia. But I've argued before that all these are interrelated. Attacks on the supply lines, attack on the supplies back in Russia, going after the factories that produce military goods, but also going after the factories that do refining, which is the economic resource that Russia needs. By attacking all these different things, the sources of the money, the source of the weapons, these supply lines that bring these weapons into Ukraine, things will just get worse and worse for the Russian military. Just a week ago or more, the Ukraine regained 7 different villages all at once, which shows that Ukraine's gains on the battlefield are long lasting. It's not just symbolic, it's not just a show like the Russians, who wish to get some quick PR out of it, but then get liquidated. It looks a little bit different coming from the Ukrainian side. Do you see that as well? And do you think that it's worsening or see signs that it's worsening for Russia now on the battlefield?
Well, it's definitely worsening for Russia. Russia has more refineries just in its nation, 48 major refineries, than all of Europe put together. I mean, John McCain said it's a gas station with nukes. He's right. It is a gas station. 28 of those 48 refineries have been put out of business or greatly diminished in their ability to produce. Look, you can't get a tank of gas in most of Russia. And if you're, and to our Crimean listening guests sitting in your gas line listening to this podcast, there is no gas. You might as well leave the line, folks. And those are really starting to have an effect. And part of that is the outfall of, look, what is the Russian strategy in Ukraine, right? Strategy is your overarching war goals. Tactics are the things you do to make it happen. Every night, Russia destroys apartment buildings in Ukraine. You and I have been there. We have seen it. You just sent me a video the other day of a Shahed going overhead. We've been there. You attack apartment buildings at night, and the Ukrainians attack your refinery, the cracking towers. They attack the specific parts of your refineries that do maximum damage to your economy. And we're seeing that, Jason. It is blown back on Russia. It's one more, you know, vital symptom of how badly Russia is running this war. We're lucky that Putin, like Hitler, like Stalin, like Pol Pot, like Saddam Hussein, he thinks he's a military genius, and there is no way that he could win this struggle, and especially with the means he's using now.
That's something I've noticed as well. I noticed that Ukraine is destroying Russia's ability to wage war, whereas the Russians, they're not. Every day there's more attacks. They attack more civilians inside of Ukraine, yet the war continues. The resolve does not change. But the Russians, we are seeing the cracks in the system. There are gas lines everywhere. We see the economy is turning south. We see more and more problems in the country. Ukraine's attacks are long lasting. They are paradigm shifts. Russia's are like nuisances, and they are unfortunately just targeted at civilians, but they do not change the fundamentals. The war is no more winnable after Russia carries out another attack on Ukraine. So what are they doing? Where do you think that the Russians at this point are hoping they can change this war? Where are they hoping that somehow these attacks, which are seemingly worthless, are going to turn the page and allow them to take Kyiv?
Well, that is never going to happen. They may never even take Kursk. And you know, we talk about these attacks on Ukrainian apartments, which happen every single night. But I'll also point out that Putin will launch 600 drones and missiles at Ukraine, which he did last week. 90% of his incoming platforms are shot down. Now, that's pretty bad, right? You shoot 100 projectiles and Ukraine shoots 90 of them down. That's good. The problem is the ones that get through are aiming at Russia's primary target. They are hospitals. They are large apartment blocks. They are cathedrals, opera houses. That's what Putin is trying to win this war by doing that. And look at Ukraine's response. They're in Kursk. They hit a power plant. You know, they're showing the Russians how it's done. And again, a strategic aviation campaign carried out by Ukraine, a nation that doesn't have a strategic air force. They don't have a navy either, but they've dominated the Black Sea. That innovation has changed the calculus of modern war. You and I talk about this all the time. Ukraine is winning the first 21st century war. Russia is going to lose it.
It is a great thing to see. Chuck, great speaking with you today.
Thanks a lot, Jason.